This morning we're going to be continuing our series going through the Beatitudes entitled Life After Calvary. And I'm going to give you a heads up. I think that once we get through the Beatitudes, I'm going to work my way through the Sermon on the Mount in its entirety. I think this is where the Lord wants us. So we're going to be walking through all of the verses of Matthew 5 to 7. Well, this morning we're going to be thinking about Matthew chapter 5, verse 6. I'm going to read that verse, but before I do that, I want to read verse 3 and then skip down to verse 6, and we're going to set this passage in context by way of introduction. The Bible says, beginning in Matthew 5, verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now reading verse 6, this is going to be our focus this morning. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied," or filled. May God bless the reading of His Word. I want to set this in its proper context. For us to do that, we need to think about the Sermon on the Mount in general, and then verse 6 in particular. What is the Sermon on the Mount all about? Well, we know that this is the greatest sermon ever preached. Adrian Rogers did not preach the greatest sermon. R.G. Lee did not preach the greatest sermon. Billy Graham did not preach the greatest sermon. Jesus Christ preached the greatest sermon. And this is it, the Sermon on the Mount. What's it all about? It's about the life of a disciple. What we are to do once we are saved. What's God's vision for our lives as believers? That's important for us to interpret the Sermon on the Mount. Because some folks believe you keep the Sermon on the Mount, you do that, and that makes you right with God. A notable example is Mahatma Gandhi. Y'all remember Gandhi, one of the leaders in the Indian independence movement in the 40s and before that. He said, and he was not a believer, he was a Hindu, he said, if you follow the principles of the Sermon on the Mount, that will make you right with God. No, he's wrong. You get right with God through Jesus, then you apply the principles of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is meant for disciples. The Sermon on the Mount is meant for believers who've closed with Jesus Christ, who are now in Him. That's the big picture. Now I want us to zoom in on verse 6. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." The key to interpreting verse 6 is the first beatitude in verse 3. It says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." If you'll remember, about 3 weeks ago, we covered that verse. And we said that to be poor in spirit is to have a self-assessment. You recognize that you have nothing to offer God. You are morally and spiritually bankrupt. You can't strive. You can't work hard enough to make yourself right with God. Instead, you have to fall on the grace and mercy of God through Jesus. When you recognize that you're poor in spirit, poverty-stricken in spirit, you're going to pursue righteousness. The things of God, His will is going to become the priority for you. And that's what Jesus talks about in verse 6. He's saying that the things of God, God's will for our lives, is no longer optional. It is the essential, the priority of our life. This morning we'll be thinking about this verse under this heading, Eating Like the King, the Christian's Diet. I'll turn it over to you now, Brother Terry.